Chapter 7. How to tour Europe on a crime a day. I developed a fraudulent scheme for every occasion. I modified the American banking system to suit myself and pumped money out of the banks. My numbers game was the perfect system, and I always had a week's running time before the hounds picked up the trail. I learned later that I was the first check swindler to use the routing numbers racket. It drove bankers mad. They didn't know what the hell was going on. They do now, and they owe me. I worked my schemes overtime, all over the nation, until I decided I was just too hot to cool down. I had to leave the country. And I decided I could worry about a passport in Mexico, since all I needed to visit Mexico was a visa. I obtained one from the Mexican consulate in San Antonio, using the name Frank Williams and presenting myself as a Pan Am pilot, and deadhead to Mexico City on a Mexican jet. When I jumped the border into Mexico in late 1967, I had illegal cash assets of nearly $500,000. I did not take the whole amount of my crime activity with me. Like a dog with access to a butcher shop, I buried my loot all over the United States, in bank safe deposit boxes from coast to coast and from the southern to the northern border. I took some $50,000 with me into Mexico, hidden in the lining of my suitcases and the linings of my jackets. A good customs officer could find the cash easily, but I didn't have to go through customs. I was wearing my Pan Am uniform and was passed along with the crew. I stayed in Mexico City a week. Then I met a Pan Am stewardess, enjoying a 5-day holiday in Mexico, and accepted her invitation to go to Acapulco for a weekend. We were on the plane when she suddenly said a bad word. "What's the matter?" I asked, surprised to hear such language from such lovely lips. "I meant to cash my paycheck at the airport," she said. "I've got exactly 3 pesos in my purse." "Oh, well, I guess the hotel will cash it." "I'll cash it if it's not too much," I said. "I'm sending my own check off tonight for deposit." "How much is it?" I really didn't care how much cash was involved. A real Pan Am check. I wanted it. I got it for $288.15 and put it carefully away. I never cashed it, although it brought me a fortune. I liked Acapulco. It was crowded with beautiful people, most of them rich, famous, or successful, sometimes all 3. We stayed at a hotel used by airline crews, but I never felt danger. Acapulco is not a place where people talk business. I stayed on after the stewardess returned to her base in Miami. And the hotel manager became friendly with me, so friendly that I decided to tell him about my problem. "Pete, I'm in trouble," I risked. "The hell you are!" he exclaimed in concerned tones. "Yeah," I replied. "My supervisor in New York just called me. He wants me to go to London on the noon plane from Mexico City tomorrow and pick up a flight there because the pilot is sick." Pete grinned. "That's a problem?" "I wish I had your troubles." I shook my head. "The thing is, Pete, I don't have my passport with me. I left it in New York and I must have it with me all the time. I can't make it back to New York in time to get my passport and get to London on schedule. And if the boss learns I'm here without a passport, he'll fire me. What the hell am I gonna do, Pete?" He whistled. His face took a thoughtful look, and then he nodded. "I don't know if this will work, but have you ever heard of a woman named Kitty Corbett?" I hadn't and said so. "Well, she's a writer on Mexican affairs, an old lady. She's been down here 20 or 30 years and is really respected. They say she has influence from the presidential palace in Mexico City to Washington, D.C., the White House even, I understand." "I believe it too," he grinned. The thing is, that's her at the table by the window. Now, I know she plays mama to every American, and she loves to do favors for anybody who seeks her out wanting something. Makes her feel like the Queen Mother, I guess. Anyway, let's go over and buy her a drink and cry a little. Maybe she can find an answer. Kitty Corbett was a kind old woman. And sharp. After a few minutes, she smiled at Pete. Okay, Pete, what's the matter? You never sit down with me unless you want something. What is it this time? Pete threw up his hands and laughed. I don't want a thing, honest. But Frank here has a problem. Tell her, Frank. I told her the same story, except I tried to make it more tragic. She looked at me when I finished. You need a passport very much, I'd say, she commented. Trouble is, you've got one. It's just in the wrong place. You can't have two passports, you know. That's illegal. I know, I said, grimacing. That worries me too. But I can't lose this job. It might be years before another airline picks me up, if at all. I was on Pan Am's waiting list for 3 years. I paused, then exclaimed, Flying jetliners is all I ever wanted to do. Kitty Corbett nodded, lost in thought. Then she said, Pete, get me a telephone over here. Pete signaled and a waiter brought a telephone to the table and Kitty Corbett began talking to the operator in Spanish. It took several minutes, but she was connected to whomever she was calling. Sonia? Kitty Corbett here, she said. Listen, I want to ask a favor of you. She went on and told her my story and then listened as the other replied. You don't have your birth certificate with you, do you? Yes, I do, I said. I carry it in my wallet. Kitty Corbett nodded and turned again to the phone. Yes, Sonia, he has a birth certificate. You think you can handle it? Great. I owe you. See you next week. She hung up and smiled. Well, Frank, if you can get to the American consulate in Mexico City by 10 o'clock tomorrow, Sonia Gunderson, the assistant consul, will issue you a temporary passport. You've lost yours, understand? And if you tell anyone about this, I'll kill you. I kissed her and ordered a bottle of the best champagne. I boarded the flight to Mexico City next morning. In Mexico City, I changed into my Pan Am pilot's uniform and walked into Miss Gunderson's office at 9:45 a.m. Sonia Gunderson was a sharp, energetic blonde, and she didn't waste any time. Your birth certificate, please. I took it from my wallet and handed it to her. She scanned it and looked at me. I thought Kitty said your name was Frank Williams. This says your name is Frank W. Abagnale, Jr. I smiled. It is. Frank William Abagnale, Jr. You know Kitty. She had a little too much champagne last night. She kept introducing me to all her friends as Frank Williams, too. But I thought she gave you my full name. She may have, agreed Miss Gunderson. Anyway, you're obviously a Pan Am pilot, and part of your name is Frank William, so you must be the one. I walked out of the consulate building 15 minutes later with a temporary passport in my pocket. I went back to the airport and changed into a suit and bought a ticket for London at the British Overseas Airways counter, paying cash. I was told the flight was delayed until 7 that evening. I changed back into my pilot's uniform and spent 6 hours supplying Mexico City with my decorative stuff. I was $6,500 richer when I flew off to London, and the Mexican feds joined the group of hunting grounds on my tail. I stayed only a few days in London. I was beginning to feel pressure on me, the same uneasiness that had bothered me in the States. I realized in London that leaving the US hadn't solved my problem, that Mexican police and Scotland Yard officers were in the same business as cops in New York or Los Angeles, that of catching crooks. And I was a crook. I was now living by simple logic. I was the hunted, the police were the hunters, so the police were the bad guys. I had to steal because I wanted to survive and to finance my constant flight from the bad guys, and for that reason I was justified in my illegal means of support. So, after less than a week in England, I filled Piccadilly with some of my production and flew off to Paris, proud of the irrational theory that I'd turned to fraud again in self-defense. A psychiatrist would explain my actions differently. He would say I wanted to be caught. Perhaps I was seeking to be caught. Perhaps I was subconsciously seeking help and my subconscious mind told me the authorities would offer that help, but I had no such clear thoughts at the time. I was fully aware that I was on a crazy carousel ride, an uncontrolled carousel from which I seemed unable to get off, but I sure as hell didn't want cops to stop it. I spent only 3 hours in Paris when I met Monique Lavalier and entered into a relationship that both opened new illegal opportunities but also destroyed my lifestyle. Looking back, I owe Monique a lot of thanks. So does Pan Am, although some of the firm's officials might argue the idea. Monique was a stewardess for Air France. I met her in the Windsor Hotel bar, where she and several dozen other Air France flight crew people were giving a party for a retiring captain pilot. If I saw that captain, I don't remember him, for I was charmed by Monique. She had all of Rosalie's charms and good qualities and none of Rosalie's frosted nature. Apparently I affected Monique the same way she affected me, for we were unable to separate during the time I was in Paris and on later visits. Monique, if she had any thoughts of marrying me, never mentioned it, but 3 days after we met, she took me home to present me to her family. The Lavaliers were delightful people, and I was especially intrigued with Papa Lavalier. He was a job printer, operator of a small printing shop near Paris. I was immediately caught with an idea for improving my check swindling involving phony Pan Am vouchers. You know, I have some good connections in the Pan Am business office, I said casually during lunch. Maybe I can arrange some printing business for Pan Am for you. Papa Lavalier beamed. Yes, yes, he exclaimed. Anything you want, we will try and do, and we would be most grateful, monsieur. Monique acted as an interpreter, for none of her family had the slightest knowledge of English. Whatever you want printed in English, my father and my brothers can do it, Monique said proudly. They are the best printers in France. I still had the actual Pan Am payroll check I took from the stewardess in Mexico. Studying it, I was struck by the difference between it and my imaginative version of a Pan Am check. My products were impressive, certainly, but one placed next to the real thing clearly shouted, "Counterfeit!" I was lucky to avoid disclosure presenting them. Obviously, the tellers who'd accepted them had never dealt with a real Pan Am check. It occurred to me, however, that European bank tellers might know Pan Am checks. Now I had another thought. Maybe Pan Am had a different type check, maybe a different colored check, perhaps, for different continents. I thought it best to check on the theory before carrying out my plan. The next morning I called Pan Am's Paris office and asked to speak to someone in the business office. I was connected with a man who sounded very young and very inexperienced, and soon proved he really was. I was becoming convinced that Lady Luck was my personal switchboard operator. "Listen, this is Jack Rogers at Freight Forwarding," I said. "I got a check here, and I think your company had sent it to us by mistake." "Well, Mr. Rogers, why do you say that?" he asked. "Because I got a check here for $1,900 sent from your New York office," I replied. but I can't find any record of anything for your company. You got any idea what this check's for? Well, Mr. Rogers, are you sure the check's from us? Well, it seems to me it is, I said. It's a regular green check with Pan Am in big letters across the top, and it's for $1,900. Mr. Rogers, that doesn't sound like one of our checks, the fellow said. Our checks are blue, and they have Pan Am, Pan Am, Pan Am wording all over the face, along with a global map of the world. Does yours have that on it? I was holding the stewardess's check in my hand. He had described it perfectly, but I didn't tell him that. Who's it signed by? What's the comptroller's name? I asked. He told me. It was the same name appearing on the check in my hand. What's the series of little numbers across the bottom? I pressed. He read them off to me. They matched the numbers on the stew's check. Nah, that's not the guy who signed this check, and the numbers don't match. I lied. So I had a valid check, which I displayed to Monique's father in his shop. He was delighted to see me, and we had no trouble speaking between the French I had learned from my mother and the English of his young printer. I talked to our business office people, I said. Now, we are printing these checks in America, a pretty expensive process. Do you think you can duplicate this check in payroll book form? If you think you can, I have the authority to give you an order of 10,000 if you can beat the New York price. He was examining the check. And what is your printer's cost for these in New York, monsieur? He asked. I didn't have the slightest idea, but I named a figure which I felt wouldn't insult New York printers. $350 per thousand, I said. He nodded. I can provide your company with a quality product that will exactly duplicate this one, and at $200 per thousand, he said proudly. I think you will find our work most satisfactory. He hesitated as if embarrassed. I know you and my daughter are close friends, and I trust you, but we usually receive a prepayment of 50%, he said in an apologizing tone. I laughed. You will have it this afternoon, I said. Papa Lavalier finished the order within a week. He provided me with gorgeous real Pan Am checks and was pleased that I was pleased. I hope we can do more work for your company, my friend, he said. Oh, you will, I assured him. In fact, we're delighted with your work. Papa Lavalier never questioned anything I asked. From the time he delivered the 10,000 Pan Am checks, he was the printer of any counterfeit document I needed or desired, an innocent victim who felt grateful to me because I opened the door of the American market to him. I learned later that he never really understood what he was printing when he did jobs for me, but worked with a blind trust in my integrity. I showered Paris with the phony checks and rented a safe deposit box for a 5-year period paid in advance to store my loot. I was astonished myself that my new operation was so easy and smooth. I rented a car, and while Monique was flying, I drove around France, cashing the checks in every village bank. I have never confirmed the suspicion, but I often thought in later months and years that the reason I was so successful with those phony Pan Am checks was because Pan Am was paying them. Papa Lavalier received a lot of business from me. I had told the Lavaliers that I was in Paris as a special representative of Pan Am, doing public relations for the firm. A month after meeting Monique, however, I told her I had to return to flying status and caught a plane to New York. But New York made me nervous. I felt I should move to a foreign climate again, but I couldn't decide whether to return to Paris and Monique or visit some new and exciting place. While I was debating with myself, I flew to Boston, where I got into jail and robbed a bank. The first event was a shock, like an unplanned pregnancy. The second one was the result of an impulse I couldn't resist. I went to Boston simply to get out of New York. I thought it would be as good as any place, and it also had a lot of banks. On arrival, I put my bags in an airport locker and visited several of the banks, exchanging some of my Pan Am false checks for actual currency. I returned to the airport early in the evening, intending to catch a flight as soon as possible. I walked up to the local airlines counter. "When's your next connecting flight to Miami?" I asked the ticket agent on duty. I had changed into my pilot's uniform. "You just missed it," he grimaced. "Who's got the next flight? National? American? Who?" I asked. "No one," he said. "You've missed any flight to Miami until tomorrow." I sat down in one of the lobby chairs, thinking the situation over. My contemplation was interrupted by two chilling words. "Frank Abagnale?" I looked up, trying to calm panic. Two tall Massachusetts state troopers, in uniform, stood over me. "You are Frank Abagnale, aren't you?" demanded one of them with a frosty voice. "My name is Frank, but it's Frank Williams," I said, and I was surprised at my calm tone that had come from my throat. "May I see your identification, please?" he asked. The words were spoken politely, but his eyes said if I didn't immediately produce my ID, he was going to pick me up and shake it out of my pockets. I handed over my ID card and my fraudulent FAA pilot's license. "Look, I don't know what this is all about, but you're badly mistaken," I said. "I fly for Pan American, and these documents are sufficient proof." The trooper studied the ID card and license, then passed them to his partner. "Why don't you stop the crap, son?" "You're Frank Abagnale, aren't you?" said the second one, almost gently. "Frank who?" I protested, pretending to be angry to cover my growing nervousness. "I don't know who the hell you're after, but it's not me." The trooper grimaced. "Well, we aren't gonna stand around here and argue with you. Come on, we're taking you in," he commanded. They didn't ask where my luggage was, and I didn't volunteer. They took me outside, placed me in their patrol car, and drove me directly to the state police offices. There I was taken into the office of a lieutenant, who, I assumed, was the shift commander. "What the hell is this?" he demanded in irritated tones. "Well, we think it's Frank Abagnale, Lieutenant," said one of the troopers. "He says he's a pilot for Pan Am." The lieutenant studied me. "You don't look very old to be a pilot," he said. "Why don't you tell the truth?" "You're Frank Abagnale. We've been looking for him for a long time. He's supposed to be a pilot, too. You match his description perfectly." "I'm 30 years old, my name is Frank Williams, and I fly for Pan Am, and I want to talk to my lawyer," I shouted. The lieutenant sighed. "Take him over to the city jail, register him for vagrancy, and then let him call a lawyer." "And call the feds." "He's their business. Let them deal with it." "Vagrancy," I protested. "I'm no vagrant. I've got nearly $200 on me." The lieutenant nodded. "Yeah, but you can't prove you're employed," he said. "Get him out of here." I was taken to the county jail in downtown Boston and was passed on to the sergeant. "Damn me, what did he do?" he asked, looking at me. "Just register him as vagrant. Someone will pick him up in the morning," said the trooper. "Vagrant." The sergeant seemed surprised. "By damn, if he's a vagrant." "Just register him," said the trooper, and he and his partner left. "Empty your pockets," the sergeant said, pulling a form from a drawer. "I'll give you a receipt for your goods." I started placing my things before him. Listen, can I keep my ID card and pilot's license? I asked. Company regulations say I must have them at all times. I'm not sure if arrest is included, but I'd still like to keep them, if you don't mind. The sergeant examined the card and the license and pushed them toward me. Sure, he said kindly. I'd say there must be some kind of a mistake here. I'm glad I'm not involved. A jailer took me upstairs and placed me in a dirty cell. I was suddenly depressed, miserable, and frightened. The game was over, I had to admit. The FBI would pick me up in the morning, I knew, and then it would be just one courtroom after another, I guessed. I looked around the jail cell. Jesus, this was a rat hole. And I didn't have a prayer of escaping. But then no man has a prayer, I thought with regret, when he believes in a swindler's God. Even a swindler's God, however, has a legion of angels. And one appeared to me now. Well, what the hell might you be doing in here? He asked, smoking the cigar. I didn't know who he was. He didn't look like anyone who could help me. Vagrancy, I said shortly. Vagrancy, he exclaimed, examining me with his sharp eyes. You're a pilot with Pan Am, aren't you? How the hell can you be a vagrant? Did somebody steal all your planes? Who are you? I asked. He threw a card to me. Aloysius James Bailout Bailey, my high-flying friend, he said. Bail bonds. The cops bring them, I spring them. You're on their territory now, pal. I can put you on mine. The street. Well, I'll tell you the truth, I said cautiously. There was this guy at the airport. He was pretty unpleasant with a girl. We had a fight. They arrested us both for fighting. I can lose my job if my commander finds out I'm in jail. He stared at me, unbelieving. What the hell are you saying? You don't have anybody to bail you out? Call one of your friends. I shrugged. I don't have any friends here. I flew in on a charter cargo job. I'm based in Los Angeles. What about the rest of your crew? He demanded. Call one of them. They went on to Istanbul. I lied. I was going to deadhead to Miami to see a chick. Well, goddamned. You are in trouble, aren't you? Said Aloysius James. Bailout. Bailey. Then he smiled. Well, my fighter pilot pal, let's see what we can do to get you out of here. He disappeared and was gone for an agonizing 10 minutes. Then he appeared in front of my cell again. Damn, your bond is $5,000, he said in a surprised tone. Sergeant says you gave the troopers a hard time. How much money you got? My hopes came back again. Just $200, maybe not that much. I sighed. He paused to think. You got a personal check? He asked suddenly. Yeah, that is, the sergeant downstairs has it, I said. Why? Because I'm gonna take your check, that's why, he said with a grin. You can write it out when the sergeant lets you free. The sergeant let me go 35 minutes later. I wrote Bailey a check for the standard 10%, $500, and handed him $100 in cash. That's a bonus, I said, laughing with joy. He drove me to the airport after I told him I was taking the first flight to Miami. This is what happened later. I have it on true sources. O'Reilly, excited with joy to demand my pilot's license himself, showed up at the jail. Bring Abagnale in, he commanded. He made bond at 3:30 this morning, volunteered a jailer. O'Reilly was close to apoplectic seizure. Bond! Bond! Who the hell bonded him out? He finally shouted. Bailey, bail out Bailey, who else? Replied the jailer. Outside, a Massachusetts detective turned to O'Reilly. We can send out information on him. O'Reilly shook his head. Forget it. That bastard is 500 miles away. No Boston cop's gonna catch him. But I stayed in Boston. As soon as Bailey had dropped me at the airport and was gone, I grabbed a cab and checked in at a nearby motel. The next morning I called the Bean State National Bank that had a branch at the airport. Security, please, I said when the switchboard operator answered. Security. Yeah, listen, this is Connors, the new guard. I don't have a uniform for tonight's shift. My damned uniform got in an accident. Where can I get a replacement, lady? I spoke in indignation. Well, we get our uniforms from Beak Brothers, the woman replied in apologizing tones. Just go down there, Mr. Connors. They'll outfit you with a replacement. I went first to Beak Brothers. No one questioned my status. Within 15 minutes I walked out with a complete guard's outfit, shirt, tie, trousers and hat, the name of the bank over the breast pocket and on the right shoulder of the shirt. I stopped at a police supply firm and bought a military belt and holster. I went to a gun shop and picked up a copy of a .38 police special. It was harmless, but only an idiot would ignore it if it were pointed at him. I then rented a station wagon with a sign, Security Bean State National Bank, on each door. At 11:15 p.m., I was standing at attention in front of the night deposit box of the Bean State National Bank Airport branch, and a beautiful sign decorated the safe's depository. Night deposit box is out of order. Please make deposits with security officer. There was a container in front of the depository. At least 35 people dropped bags or envelopes into the container. Not one of them said more than good evening or good night. When the last shop had closed, I fixed the top of the canvas bag and began pulling the loot to the station wagon. I became stuck in the exit door because the container was just too heavy. What's going on, buddy? I twisted my head and nearly lost my senses. 2 state troopers were standing less than 5 feet away. Well, the box is out of order, and the truck broke down, and I've got the bank station wagon out here, I said, grinning. The older one, a red-faced redhead, laughed. Well, hell, let us help you with it, he said, stepped forward and grabbed the handle of the box. With 3 of us pulling, it came easily. They helped me to the station wagon and assisted me in lifting the heavy cargo into the back of the car. I shut the car door and turned to the officers. I appreciate it, boys, I said, smiling. I'd offer the coffee, but I must get this little fortune to the bank. They laughed and one lifted a hand. Next time, okay? Less than an hour later, I had the loot in my motel room and was sorting out the cash. Bills only. I threw the change, credit card receipts, and checks into the bathtub. I counted $62,800 in currency. An hour later, I was on a flight to Miami. I had a 30-minute delay in New York. I used the time to call the manager of the airport in Boston. I didn't get him, but I got his secretary. Listen, tell the Bean State Bank people they can get the majority of the loot from last night's depository theft in the bathtub of room 208, Rest Haven Motel, I said and hung up. The next day I flew out of Miami to Istanbul. I had a short stop in Tel Aviv. I had my code of honor. In my whole career, I never fooled a square John as an individual. I sought out a branch of an American bank. and laid dollar bills on the counter before a teller. "I want a $5,000 cashier's check," I said. "Yes, sir." "And your name?" "Frank Abagnale, Jr.," I said. "All right, Mr. Abagnale. Do you want this check made out to you?" I shook my head. "No," I said. "Make it payable to Aloysius James Bailout Bailey in Boston, Massachusetts." Chapter 8. A small crew will do. It's just a paper airplane. An escort is expected of some people. The President, Queen Elizabeth, Frank Sinatra, Muhammad Ali. Most celebrities, in fact. And airline pilots. "Where's your crew, sir?" asked the desk clerk in the Istanbul hotel. It was a question I'd encountered before. "I don't have a crew with me," I replied. "I just flew in to replace a pilot who became sick." It was my standard answer to such questions, which were much more numerous in Europe and the Middle East than in the United States. Continental hotels, obviously, usually house their crews. A lonely pilot arouses curiosity, and curiosity arouses suspicion. I needed a crew, I thought that evening while dining in a Turkish restaurant. I wasn't wearing my uniform. I now wore it only on special occasions when checking in and checking out of a hotel, passing a check or having a free ride. The matter of a crew had entered my mind before. In fact, it entered my mind each time I saw a command pilot surrounded by his crew. His status was not only more believable than mine, but he also always seemed to have much more fun than I. My fantasies of an aircrew of my own, of course, were driven by more than just a desire for companionship. An aircrew, and I thought only of stewardesses, would make my role of airline pilot really valid. With a crew behind me, I could cash the phony checks in great numbers. The next day I flew to Paris to visit the Lavaliers. "I wish you flew for Air France. I could be a member of your crew," Monique said at one point during the visit. The remark convinced me that an aircrew was a necessary thing. But how could a pilot without portfolio, who didn't know how to fly, get an aircrew? I could not simply gather a few girls and offer, "Hey kids, want to go to Europe? I've got this worthless checks." And since I had absolutely no connections in the criminal world, American or European, I couldn't look for help there. I was in West Berlin when a solution presented itself. Pan Am had always provided me with the ideas. If the carrier wasn't my parent company, I was in a sense its bastard child, and this was an issue demanding proper loyalty. I'd let Pan Am provide me with a flight crew. I flew to New York and on arrival called Pan Am's personnel office, representing myself as the placement director of a small Western college, Prescott Presbyterian Normal. "I'm aware that you people send employment recruiting teams to various colleges and universities, and I wondered if you might possibly have our school on your schedule this year," I said. "I'm sorry we don't," said the Pan Am personnel officer who took my call. "However, we will have a team on the University of Arizona campus during the last 2 weeks in October, interviewing students for various positions, and I'm sure they'd be glad to talk to any of your students who might be interested in a career with Pan Am. If you like, we can mail you some brochures." "That would be nice," I said, and gave him a fictitious address for my unreal college. I had a plan that demanded the courage of a mountain climber. I sat down and wrote a letter to the director of the University of Arizona Placement Office. Pan Am, I said, was starting a new recruiting scheme this year. In addition to the regular personnel recruiters who would visit the campus in October, the letter stated, Pan Am was also sending pilots and stewardesses to interview prospective pilots and flight attendants, since actual flight crewmen could offer a better idea of what a flying position with Pan Am would require and could also consider the applicants more carefully. A pilot will be visiting your campus on Monday, September 9th, and will be available for 3 days to interview stewardess applicants, the false letter stated. Under separate cover, we are sending you some brochures and employment application forms which you might wish to give to students. I signed the name of Pan Am's Director of Personnel to the letter and placed it in a Pan Am envelope. I packed the brochures and application forms in one of the large folders. Then I went to Pan Am's office building, sought out the airline's mail room, and dropped the envelope off with a young clerk, ordering to send it by air mail. On August 28th, I called the University of Arizona and was connected with John Henderson, Director of Student Placement. Mr. Henderson, this is Frank Williams, a co-pilot for Pan American World Airways, I said. I am scheduled to visit your campus. Oh, yes, Mr. Williams. Henderson sounded enthusiastic. We're looking forward to your visit, and we have received your material. In fact, we've posted it about campus, and you should have a good number of applicants. I appeared on the University of Arizona campus at 8 a.m., Monday, September 9th, and Henderson greeted me warmly. I was, of course, in uniform. Henderson prepared a small room for my use during my stay. We have 30 applicants to date, and I have scheduled them to appear in groups of 10 each day, he said. I know, of course, you'll be talking to them individually, and you can set your own daily schedule if you wish. But the first 10 will be here at 9 a.m. Well, I think I'll talk to them as a group at first, and then interview them individually, I said. The first group of 10 students was, collectively and individually, simply lovely. More than ever, looking at them, I saw the need for a crew of my own. The 10 of them stared at me like I was Elvis Presley. I chose a businesslike tone. First of all, ladies, I want you to know this is as new to me as it is to you. I'm more accustomed to a cockpit than a classroom, but the company has assigned me this task and I hope I can carry it out successfully. With your help and understanding, I think I can. I say understanding because I don't have the authority to say who will be hired and who will not. My job is just to select girls who I think would be most suitable as flight attendants and to make a recommendation. There is also this: it's unlikely any of you will be hired by Pan Am before you graduate. But if you are selected as a future stewardess, it's our policy to give you some sort of assistance during your last year in school so that you won't be tempted to take some other job. Am I making myself clear? I was. The girls said so. I then began interviewing them individually, and by the afternoon of the third day I reduced the list to 12 candidates. I spent a couple of hours studying the files of the 12 on an individual basis, recalling my own interviews with them and my impressions of them, before I chose 8. I was leaving the records room when I invented a funny trick, one that took me less than 30 minutes to satisfy. When I left the room, Frank Abagnale, Jr., a native of Bronx, had transcripts showing him to have both a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in social work. The next morning I delivered my decision to my 8 finalists. The girls were excited. Calm down, please calm down, I pleaded. You haven't been hired as stewardesses. The words achieved the desired shock. An immediate total silence. Then I grinned and threw it on them. That's because you're all juniors and we want you to finish your education before joining Pan Am, I said. I think I mentioned before that the company likes to assist approved stewardess candidates during their last year in school, and I have the authority to make you 8 girls an offer I think you'll find interesting. I am informed that the company intends to hire a number of girls as summer interns for the coming year, and these girls will be sent to Europe in different groups to act as advertising representatives and public relations people. That is, they'll be used as models for photographs for Pan Am ads in various world publications, and some will be used as speakers at schools, civil group meetings, business seminars, and that sort of thing. It's a tour, and usually we use real stewardesses or professional models dressed up in flight attendant uniforms. But this coming summer, we're going to use girls who've applied for stewardess positions, and it will serve as sort of a training period for them. I personally think it's a good idea for several reasons. One, it will allow our ad people to use pictures of our own personnel and cities we serve, and secondly, we won't need to pull actual stewardesses off the flight line when a photo situation calls for an actual stewardess. Now, if any or all of you would like to take part in the program this summer, I have the authority to hire you. You'll have an expense-paid tour of Europe. You'll be paid the same salary as a starting stewardess, and you'll dress as stewardesses, but you won't be stewardesses. We'll supply your uniforms. Also, you'll be given a letter of employment, which is very important in this case. It means that those of you who decide to become stewardesses after graduation will apply as former Pan Am employees, and you'll be given advantage over all other applicants. Do I have any volunteers among you? They all volunteered. Okay, I said, smiling. Now you'll all need passports. That's your responsibility. I'll also need your addresses so the company can keep in touch with you. I'm sure you'll have your letters of employment within a month. That's it, ladies. I've certainly enjoyed meeting you all, and I hope that if and when you become stewardesses, some of you will be assigned to my crew. I informed Henderson of the offer I'd made the girls, and he was as delighted as they had been. In fact, Henderson, his wife, and the 8 girls all invited me that night to a delightful dinner party around the pool in the Hendersons' house. I flew back to New York and rented a box with mail answering service that had offices in the Pan Am building. It was the perfect cover, since it allowed me to use Pan Am's own address in exchange of letters I had with the girls, but all their replies were directed to my box with the mail service firm. After a week or so, I sent a letter of employment to each of them, along with a covering letter signed by myself, as Frank Williams, informing each of them that surprise! I am assigned by the company to head up the European operation with them, so they were going to be my crew, after all. Then I turned to getting ready for the tour myself. The passport I had was only a temporary one, and in my real name. I decided I needed a regular passport that I could use as Frank Williams and decided to take a chance, hoping that the passport office in New York was too busy to play cop. I walked into the office one morning with my temporary passport, and 10 days later was issued a regular passport. I was pleased to have the document, but it was, after all, issued to Frank W. Abagnale, Jr. It was not a passport that would serve. 10 a.m. First Officer Frank W. Williams. I started looking around and found what I needed in the Hall of Records of a large East Coast city. It was the death notice of Francis W. Williams, aged 20 months, who had died at that young age on November 22, 1939. The archives told the infant had been born on March 12, 1938, in a local hospital. I obtained a certified copy of the birth certificate for $3 by presenting myself to one of the clerks as the same Francis W. Williams. It seemed logical to me, and I'm sure it would seem logical to anyone else, that anyone named Francis would prefer to be called Frank. I took the copy of the birth certificate to the passport office in Philadelphia, together with the necessary photos, and 2 weeks later had a second passport, which matched my Pan Am uniform. I was now ready to command my crew. I spent those months preparing to complete my fantasy. I knew the name of the Hollywood fashion firm that designed and manufactured all of the stewardess uniforms for Pan Am. I flew to Hollywood and, wearing my Pan Am pilot's outfit, presented a phony letter of introduction to the woman in charge of Pan Am's account and told her the details of the fictional public relations tour of Europe. "We'll have the uniforms ready in 6 weeks," she said. "I assume you also want luggage for each of the girls?" "Of course," I said. When the uniforms were ready, I picked them up personally, driving a rented station wagon with counterfeit Pan Am logos on the doors, and paid for the uniforms. In May, I sent each of the girls a letter with an airline ticket for each tickets I'd bought and paid for with cash, and telling them to arrive at the lobby of the Los Angeles airport on May 26th. The gathering of my birds was one of my brightest and most courageous shows. I went to one of the most luxurious hotels near the airport and booked a room for each of the girls, and also booked, for the day after their arrival, one of the hotel's conference rooms. I made all the bookings in Pan Am's firm name, although I paid cash. On the morning of the girls' arrival, I put on my Pan Am pilot's uniform and visited Pan Am's operational department at the airport, seeking out the manager of the carrier's car park. "Look, I've got 8 stewardesses coming in at 2 p.m. today on a special mission, and I need some transportation to get them to the hotel," I said. "You think you can help me out?" "Sure," he said. "I've got a regular crew wagon available. I'll pick them up myself." "You gonna be there?" "I'll just meet you here at 1:30 and go with you," I said. The girls showed up on time and were impressed with the Pan Am crew wagon. The manager of the car park and I loaded their luggage, and he drove us all to the hotel, where he again assisted in unloading their luggage and getting the girls settled. I offered to buy him a drink after we finished, but he refused. "I like your kind of duty," he said, grinning. "Just call me anytime." The next morning I met the girls in the conference room. There were more cries of joy when I gave the details of the tour: London, Paris, Rome, Athens, Geneva, Munich, Berlin, Madrid, Oslo, Copenhagen, Vienna, and other European capitals. I calmed them and spoke in the tone of a strict father. "Now, this sounds like a lot of fun, and I hope it will be, but we're on serious business, and I won't allow any nonsense," I told them. "I have the authority to dismiss any one of you for bad acts or mistakes, and I will send you home if I have to. Let's get one thing straight: I'm the boss, and you will live by my instructions and follow them. I think you'll find my rules pretty fair, and you should have no trouble following them, and therefore no trouble at all. Does anyone have any questions?" No one did. I smiled. "Okay, then, you're on your own for the rest of the day and the night. But get a good night's sleep. We leave tomorrow for London." And we really did, using tickets that had cost me a small fortune in cash. We landed in London on a rainy morning, and I instructed the girls to change into their stewardess uniforms before we went to the hotel. The girls slept until nearly noon. Then I allowed them to walk in the town by themselves, telling them I had set up a photo session with the local Pan Am office. What I did was to go through the London telephone book until I found what I was looking for: a commercial photography firm. I called the company and identified myself as a Pan Am public relations representative. "I've got 8 girls at the Royal Gardens, stewardesses, and what we need is some color in black and white photos suitable for advertisements and promotion brochures, beautiful stuff of the girls at Piccadilly, some of them at the Thames bridges, that sort of thing," I said. "Do you think you can handle it?" "Oh, quite." The man to whom I spoke was very enthusiastic. "Why don't you look at some samples of our work? I'm sure we can do business, Mr. Williams." The firm's representative and I had lunch and worked out a deal. I'd picked one of the better firms in London, it seemed. They'd even done some work in the past for Pan Am. "Well, this is a little different, something new we're trying," I said. One thing you'll like, I'm sure, is that you'll be paid in cash at the end of each day. Just give me an invoice for the amount. We've got a heavy schedule and can leave soon, so just send the invoices to the Public Relations and Advertising Department of Pan Am in New York. If they decide to use any of your pictures, you'll be paid again at your normal commercial rate for each picture selected. He whistled and raised his glass of beer. That is a different way of doing things, and I like it, he said, grinning happily. The next morning, a 3-man camera crew in a passenger van loaded with photographic equipment showed up the hotel and picked up my 8 fledglings. I didn't go with them, but simply told the chief cameraman to use his own imagination and return the girls in a reasonably proper condition. Gotcha, boss. He laughed and led the girls into the van. I had business of my own. I had started this tour well supplied with sinful stuff, counterfeit cashier's checks, products of my own handiwork, Pan Am expense checks and regular paychecks, Papa Lavalier's artwork, and Pan Am check forms stolen from Pan Am's own stores department. There were a lot of factors in my favor. London and most of the other major European cities had branches of major American banks. We flew to Rome that afternoon, where, over the next 3 days, the procedure was repeated. The hotel cashier in Rome, too, was doubtful about the amount of the expense checks, but was satisfied with my explanation. Well, I'm sorry about that, I said. But we're on an 18-day tour of Italy, and of course, you can give me change in lira if you like. He liked, since it meant a personal profit of some $50 for him. I decided against traveling around Europe by air, not because of the expense, but because it would present the girls constantly to other airline crews. That was my biggest problem in my scheme, hiding the girls from other airline people. The girls cooperated perfectly in that respect. And I rented a comfortable, almost luxurious Volkswagen bus for our tour around Europe. At times, my scheme seemed more like a lazy vacation than a criminal venture. We often spent days, sometimes a week or more, in colorful little out-of-the-way places in this or that country, and during such delays I stopped my crooked activities. It was not part of my plan to deceive the peasants. Every 2 weeks I paid the girls with a counterfeit payroll check, then had them back to me in return for cash. Since I was paying all their expenses, most of them bought money orders and sent them home to their parents or their bank. The girls were absolutely innocent, of course. Not one, during the summer, ever had a suspicion she was involved in a criminal venture. Each thought she was legally employed by Pan Am. They were completely fooled by my con plan. When we visited Paris and I sought Monique out, and she informed me our relationship was finished. I'll still be your friend, Frank, and I hope you'll still help Papa in his business, but I want to settle down and you don't, she said. I've met another man, a pilot for Air France, and we're pretty serious about our future. I assured her of my understanding and, in fact, was rather relieved. I also assured her that her father would continue to get Pan Am business, although that statement was a lie. I was beginning to feel some guilt concerning my dishonest use of Papa Lavalier, and decided to stop using him as a chess piece in my dishonest game. The girls and I ended our tour of Europe in Copenhagen, where I put them on a plane for Arizona. I delivered them back to the States with roses in their arms and a flowery speech designed to calm any suspicions that might appear in their minds in coming weeks. I had had a wonderful time, all things considered. If the girls put a lot of gray hairs on my head, they also put a lot of green stuff in my pockets. Something like $300,000 in all. Keep your uniforms, keep your ID cards, and keep your check receipts. I'd always return a check receipt when I cashed a check, I instructed them. If the company wants the uniforms and IDs back, you'll be contacted. Return to school, because we're not going to hire you on a permanent basis until you graduate, and then you'll be contacted by a company representative. The girls really heard from Pan Am, as a matter of fact. After 3 months of photographs, from dozens of European cities and all showing the same 8 girls in Pan Am stewardess uniforms, advertising managers of Pan Am started an investigation. Eventually, the whole matter ended up in O'Reilly's hands, and he analyzed it and informed the carrier's officers and also the girls. I understand all 8 of them took it gracefully. I stayed in Europe for several weeks after I separated with the girls, then returned to the States, where I moved around like a gypsy for several weeks, never staying in one place for more than 2 or 3 days. I was becoming nervous and depressed again, and the knowledge that I would probably always be a man on the move, a fox constantly hunted by the hounds, was beginning to press on my conscience, affecting my conscious life. I practically stopped my check swindling activities. I was afraid the hounds were very close. Only rarely was I challenged to display my creative criminal talent. One such time was in a large Midwestern city. I was sitting in the airport restaurant after arrival, enjoying lunch, when I became interested in the conversation, an exchange between an elderly man and a very young companion, apparently an employee. I understood from the conversation that the older man was a banker, on his way to a convention in San Francisco, and from the remarks he made to the young man it was clear he expected his bank to make money in his absence. He was obviously proud of his high status, and later when he was checking in I learned his name. Jasper P. Cashman. That afternoon I did some investigation into Jasper P. Cashman's background, using a local newspaper's library. J. P. Cashman was a famous man in his community. He started as a teller in his bank when it had assets of less than $5 million. He was president now and the bank's assets reached $100 million. I went to the bank the following day. It was a new large building. Tellers on one side, junior officers across an opposite wall. Senior officers in separate offices. Cashman's offices on the 3rd floor. J. P. Cashman didn't believe in close contact with the employees. I rented a car, drove to a modest distant city, and opened a checking account for $10,000 with a counterfeit cashier's check. Then I returned to Cashman's town, and the next day came to his bank. I wasn't really interested in the money involved in my swindle. Cashman's manner had irritated me, and I simply wanted to cheat him. I was the picture of the rich businessman when I entered the bank. Gray 3-piece suit. A leather briefcase, slim and elegant. Cashman's companion at the airport was one of the junior officers. His desk was neat. His nameplate was new. He obviously was promoted not long ago. I dropped into the chair in front of his desk. "Yes, sir, can I help you?" he asked, impressed by my dress and manner. "Yes, you can, as a matter of fact," I said easily. "I'm Robert Lehman from Junction, and I need to cash a check, a rather large one. I have all the proper identification, and you can call my bank to verify, but I don't think that'll be necessary." J. P. Cashman knows me, and he'll verify the check. You can call him. No, I'll do it myself, since I need to talk to him anyway. Before he could react, I picked up his telephone and dialed Cashman's correct number. Cashman's secretary answered. "Yes, Mr. Cashman, please." "He isn't." "Oh, yes, he mentioned that last week." "Well, listen, would you tell him when he returns that Bob Lehman dropped by, and tell him Jean and I are looking forward to seeing him and Mildred in Junction for the hunt. He'll know what I mean." "Yes, thank you." I replaced the telephone and stood up, grimacing. "Doesn't look like my day," I said sadly. "I really needed the cash." I can't get to Junction and back in time for this deal. Well, good day, sir. I started to turn and the young officer stopped me. How big is the check you wanted to cash, Mr. Lehman? Pretty large, I said. I need $7,500. Do you think you can take care of it? I can give you the number of my bank in Junction. Without waiting for a reply, I dropped back into the chair, quickly wrote out a check for $7,500 and handed it to him. As I expected, he didn't call the bank in Junction. He stood up. Sir, I'll have to talk to Mr. James, the vice president, to confirm the check, which I'm sure he will. I'll be back in a moment. He walked into James's office and said, as I later learned, exactly what I'd forced him to say. Sir, there's a Mr. Lehman here from Junction, and he needs to cash this rather large check. He's a personal friend of Mr. Cashman, and he wanted to see Mr. Cashman, but as you know, Mr. Cashman's in San Francisco. A personal friend of the old man's? Yes, sir, business and social, I understand. Cash it. We sure as hell don't want to irritate any of the old man's friends. A minute later, the young officer was handing the phony check to a teller. Cash this for the gentleman, please. Mr. Lehman, I'm glad I could help you. But I wasn't pleased with the swindle. In fact, I didn't enjoy it at all. I left town that day and several days later stopped in a remote village to do some reflection. My thoughts were depressing. I was no longer living, I decided. I was surviving. I had got a fortune with my dishonest impersonations, swindles and crimes, but I wasn't enjoying the results of my hard work. I concluded it was time to retire, to go to Earth like a fox in a remote and secure place where I could relax and start a new and crime-free life. I reviewed the places I had been on the map of my mind. I was astonished at the number of places I visited, recalling my trips of the past few years. I had crisscrossed the globe from Singapore to Stockholm, from Tahiti to Trieste, from Baltimore to the Baltics, and to other places I had forgotten the names. But one place I hadn't forgotten, and its name kept coming into my thoughts as I sought a safe refuge. Montpellier, France. Montpellier. That was my safe refuge, I finally decided. I have made the decision, and I didn't give it a second thought. I should have. Chapter 9. Does this check include the tip? The vineyards of Languedoc produce more wine than the other three great French wine departments combined. With one or two exceptions, the wine of Languedoc has a taste of a really bad juice. I learned all about wine culture in Montpellier. The first thing I learned was not to drink the local wine. I was probably the only water drinker in town. However, I didn't go to Montpellier for either the wine or the water. I was there to hide. I had passed through Montpellier, driving from Marseille to Barcelona, during one of my first bad check trips through Europe. Outside of town, I had parked under a huge olive tree and picnicked on cheese, bread, sausages, and soft drinks I'd picked up in the city. I felt comfortable, easy, almost happy. As if I were home. In a sense, I was. This part of southern France was my mother's native land. She had been born here. After the war in Algiers, her parents had returned here with their other children. My grandparents, several uncles and aunts, and a set of cousins still lived within an hour's drive of the olive tree. I had never forgotten that calm, enjoyable stop near Montpellier. And when, at the old age of 20, I decided to retire from my life as a counterfeit person, I chose Montpellier as my refuge. Montpellier, in many ways, was ideal for my purpose. It was not a tourist attraction. It was situated far from the Mediterranean, yet close enough to reach it by car. It was large enough so that an American as its resident would not excite curiosity, yet too small to have an international airport or large hotel operators. There were no Hiltons or Sheratons in Montpellier, and its tiny airport served only light aircraft. The lack of air service or expensive hotels was an advantage in my favor. There was very little chance of meeting a pilot, a stewardess, or a hotel employee who might recognize me. I presented myself in Montpellier as Robert Mongeau, a successful screenwriter from Los Angeles, in order to explain the large account I opened in one of the local banks. I didn't deposit all the money I took with me to Montpellier because I didn't want to arouse any curiosity about my actual income. I bought a small cottage, a charming little house with a tiny backyard surrounded by a high fence, where the previous owner had a small garden. I bought a Renault, one of the most comfortable models, but not luxurious enough to attract attention. Within 2 weeks I felt at home, secure and happy in my new home. And if God had deprived the Mediterranean Languedoc of good grapes, he rewarded it with the people. They were friendly, courteous and kind, quick to smile and to offer any assistance. The women in my neighborhood were always knocking on my door with gifts of cakes or fresh baked bread. My neighbor, Armand Perriger, was my favorite. He was a huge man of 75 and he still worked in a vineyard, riding to and from work on a bicycle. He came the first time with 2 bottles of wine, one red and one white. Most of our wines do not suit American tastes, he said in his loud yet kind voice. But there are a few good wines in the Languedoc, and these 2 are among them. The people of Montpellier drank more wine than any other liquid. A lunch or dinner was not served without wine. I have even seen wine at breakfast. Montpellier was a good place to learn about wines, Armand said. We have the Wine University of France right here in our city, he said proudly. You can go there and study. I never visited the university because I had no taste for wine, although I drank it on social occasions. I was satisfied with the information given by Armand. He was a good teacher. He never gave tests and he never graded me. It was difficult for me to stay busy. Doing nothing is hard work. I spent a lot of time driving around. I drove to the coast and spent a few days on the beach there. At the end of the first month, I drove to the small village where my grandparents lived and spent 3 days with them. My grandmother wrote letters regularly to my mother, and she was aware of all the events at home. My mother was well, my sister and brothers were well, too. My father was still trying to win my mother back, and my grandmother found it funny. My mother had apparently told my grandmother that I was hitchhiking all around the world, seeking a goal and attempting to decide my future, and I tried to confirm that impression during my visit. I did not tell my grandparents that I was living in Montpellier. I told them I was on my way to Spain, with the thought in mind of entering one of the Spanish universities. I visited them a second time during my stay in Montpellier. I told them on that occasion that I hadn't found a Spanish college that challenged me and was returning to Italy to look for the university there. As I became more satisfied with my life in Montpellier, I actually thought of my education. I also started thinking about getting a job or opening some kind of small business, perhaps a stationery store, since I was tired of the lazy, luxurious life I was leading. I was still considering the idea of registering at the university and of finding some useful employment when both issues became doubtful. For months after settling down in Montpellier, I learned a bitter truth. When the hounds have help, there is no safe place for a fox to hide. I shopped regularly at a small, by American standards, market near Montpellier. This occasion was one of my scheduled shopping trips. Returning to the counter, I saw 4 men at the checkers stand with no customers or clerk around. They had guns and pistols. My first thought was that bandits were robbing the store and that the employees and customers were on the floor. But as I turned to seek cover, one of the men shouted, "Abagnale!" 3 other men in uniform came at me from all sides, all pointing a weapon at me. "Hands up! Hands on your head! Face down on the floor!" I had my hands up. I didn't know which of the other commands to follow, but I sure as hell didn't want to be shot. And the officers were holding their weapons in a manner that scared me. "For God's sake, don't shoot," I shouted. "One of you tell me what you want me to do and I'll do it." A tall, thin man pointed his pistol at me. "Get on the floor, face down," he ordered. I did as he instructed. Some hands twisted my arms behind my back and other uncaring hands put steel handcuffs around my wrists. I was driven directly to the Montpellier police station. No one said a word. At the station, the strict detective and 2 other officers got straight to the point, but didn't read out any rights a criminal may have. I don't think a crook has any rights in France. "My name is Marcel Gaston, of the French Police Department of Criminal Investigation," said the officer. "You are Frank Abagnale, are you not?" "I'm Robert Monjo," I said in indignant tones. "I'm a writer from California, an American." "I'm afraid you gentlemen have made a very serious mistake." Gaston beat me with a sharp, painful blow. "Most of the mistakes I make, mister, are serious mistakes, but I have not made a mistake in this case." "You are Frank Abagnale." "I am Robert Monjo," I said, searching their faces for a sign of doubt. "We could beat it out of you, but that isn't necessary," he said. "I have all the time in the world, Abagnale, but I don't intend to waste too much of it on you. We can hold you for a very long time, or at least until we find witnesses to identify you. Until then, unless you choose to cooperate, I am going to place you in the cell for criminals. You can stay there for a week, 2 weeks, a month, it makes no difference to me. You will have no food and water until you decide to confess. Why don't you just tell us what we want to know right now? We know who you are. We know what you have done. You will have a lot of inconveniences. I promise you." I looked at Gaston and knew he meant every word he had spoken. "I'm Frank Abagnale," I said. I never really gave them the kind of confession they wanted. I never volunteered any details on any of the crimes I'd committed in France. But if they knew this or that event and presented the details of it, I nodded and said, "That's how it happened," or, "Yes, that was me." Gaston wrote a document, which was a list of my crimes in France, the circumstances of my arrest, and let me read it. "If that is correct, you will help yourself by signing it," he said. This document also gave the details how I was caught. An Air France stewardess, visiting relatives in Montpellier, saw me shopping a couple of weeks ago and recognized me. On her return to Paris, she told her captain of her suspicions. The captain called the police. I never learned which Air France stewardess reported on me. No one told me. I hoped it wasn't Monique, but to this day I still don't know the informant's identity. I don't think it was Monique, however. I was kept 6 days in Montpellier, where several lawyers offered their services. I selected a middle-aged man whose manners and appearance reminded me of Armand, although he said he didn't believe he could win me my freedom. "I have looked over all the police documents," he commented. "The best we can hope for is a light sentence." A week after my arrest, to my astonishment, I was removed to Perpignan, a town near the Spanish border, and the day after my arrival there I was brought to trial in a court of a judge, 2 prosecutors and 9 local resident jurors, who had to decide my guilt or innocence. It wasn't much of a trial, really, it took less than 2 days. Gaston read a list of my crimes and the evidence he'd gathered to support the accusations. There were many witnesses against me. I was found guilty. But at that time I thought with joy that my lawyer had lost the battle but won the war. The judge sentenced me to only 1 year in prison. I was returned to Perpignan's prison, the house of arrest, a dark stone fortress built in the 17th century, and only after I stayed a few days there I realized what this light sentence really meant. I was received by 2 guards who ordered me to take off all of my clothes and then escorted me, still naked, to a narrow corridor. The guard stopped before one of the metal doors, unlocked and opened it. The door produced a sound reminding that from a horror movie, and the guard pushed me inside the dark cell. I fell forward, striking my head against the wall of the cell. I had not noticed the 2 steps leading to the floor. I never actually saw the steps. I was in total darkness. A wet, chilling, frightening darkness. I stood up to search for the light switch and hit my head against the steel ceiling. There was no light switch. There was no light in the cell. There was, in fact, nothing in the cell but a bucket. No bed, no toilet, no wash basin, nothing. Just a bucket. The cell was not a cell, actually, it was a hole, 5 feet wide, 5 feet high and 5 feet deep, with a ceiling and door of steel and a floor and walls of stone. The ceiling and door were chilled to the touch. The walls wept chilly tears constantly. I waited for my eyes to get accustomed to the darkness. It came into the cell from any source. My eyes did not get accustomed. The eyes do not get accustomed to total darkness. I fell on the floor, shaking and feeling like I was buried alive. Panic added to my shaking. I tried to calm myself by analyzing my situation. Surely, I told myself, this was not the cell I would occupy during the whole year. Probably I wasn't here for observation. I left the theory immediately. Anyone observing me in this cell must have X-ray eyes. All right then, I was given a taste of what could happen to me. Certainly no civilized country would permit such cruel punishment. France does. Or did. I was not fed my first day in Perpignan's prison. Several hours later, cold, hungry, embarrassed, frightened and lonely, I lay down on the hard floor and fell asleep. I slept twisted, for I am 6 feet tall. The sound of the door woke me up. I sat up, feeling pain caused by my uncomfortable sleeping position. The guard placed something on the steps inside my cell and started to close the door. Wait! Wait! I shouted. Why am I kept in here? How long will I stay in here? Until you complete your sentence, he said, and shut the door. I fell back, astonished by the horrible truth. A year? I must live in this rat hole a year? Without light? Without bed? Without clothes? Without toilet? And without God knows what else. It was impossible, I told myself. No man could live in such darkness, under such conditions, for a year. He would die, and his death would be slow and terrible. I was suddenly scared. I did not know how I could survive a year in this prison. I still have nightmares from my stay in Perpignan's house of arrest. I never left the cell. I was not allowed to write letters, and if any of my relatives knew I was jailed at Perpignan and wrote me, I did not receive the mail. My requests to contact my relatives, my lawyer, the Red Cross, or the American consulate were ignored except once. On that occasion, the guard hit my head with his huge hand. "Don't talk to me," he said. It is not permitted. Don't talk, don't sing, don't whistle, don't make any sound or you will be beaten. The menu in Perpignan prison never changed. For breakfast, I was served bread and water. Lunch consisted of a weak chicken soup and bread. Supper was a cup of black coffee and bread. I had no means of telling time, and I soon lost track of the days. My weight was 210 pounds when I was received at Perpignan. The prison food did not contain enough calories to maintain me. My body began to feed upon itself, the muscles destroying the stored fats in order to fuel my heart and my circulatory system. Within weeks I was able to connect my fingers around my biceps. The bucket was my toilet. I was not given any toilet paper, and the bucket was not removed after use. I soon got accustomed to the horrible odor, but after a few days the bucket was full and I had to move around and sleep in my own excrements. I was not allowed to shave. My hair was soon below my shoulders, and my beard reached my chest. I had no doubt that many of the men in Perpignan were mad, driven to lunacy by the cruel manner in which they were treated. I was certain after a few weeks that I would lose my own clear mind. I lost the ability to understand what was real and what was unreal, and began to hallucinate. I imagined myself back in the royal gardens, surrounded by my lovely crew, having a delicious dinner in a restaurant, or walking along the golden beaches, my arm around Monique. In my fantasies, I was anyone I wanted to be, much as I'd been during the 5 years before my arrest, although I added new roles to my Perpignan impersonations. I was a famous surgeon, operating on the president and saving his life with my medical skills. A great writer, winning the Nobel Prize for Literature. A movie director, making an Oscar-winning movie. A mountain guide, saving unlucky climbers trapped on a dangerous mountain. I was worker, clerk, Indian chief, baker, banker, and talented thief. Still, time passed. And one day the door opened, letting the light that was the first light I knew in prison. Turn around, face the back of your cell, and shut your eyes, a voice ordered. I did as instructed, my heart beating. Was this the day of my release? Do not turn around, but open your eyes slowly and let them get accustomed to the light, the voice instructed. I will leave this open for an hour, then I'll be back. I slowly opened my eyes and found myself surrounded by a bright, golden light, too bright for my weak eyes. I had to shut them again. Finally, I was able to look without pain. Even so, the cell was still dark. An hour later the guard returned, or at least the voice sounded the same. Close your eyes again, he instructed. I am going to turn up the lights further. I did so, and when he instructed me, I opened my eyes slowly and cautiously. I felt scared and sick as I looked around. The walls were wet. The ceiling was wet too. The floor was covered with excrements and worms. I vomited. It was perhaps another hour before the guard returned. This time he opened the door. Come with me, he ordered. I moved from the dirty cell without hesitation, experiencing pains in my neck, shoulders, arms, and legs as I straightened up for the first time since my arrival. I could hardly walk. He led me downstairs and into a large room. Stand here, he ordered, and disappeared. I turned, inspecting the room, and then stopped as I suddenly saw the most disgusting creature I had ever encountered. It was a man. It had to be a man, but God in heaven, what manner of man was this? He was tall and thin. His dirty, twisted hair and beard reached his waist. He was naked and his dirty body was covered sores and scabs. The nails of his fingers and toes were grown out and curved. I shuddered as I looked at the creature. I shuddered again as I recognized the man. I was facing myself in the mirror. I was still horrified at my appearance when the guard returned, with the clothes over his arm and a pair of shoes in his hand. I recognized the clothes I was wearing when I was received in the prison. "Put these on," said the guard. "Can't I have shower and shave first, please?" I asked. "No, put on the clothes," he said, looking at me with disgust. I hurried to put on my clothes, which were now several sizes too large for me. Almost immediately 2 gendarmes appeared, one of them carrying chains. He fixed a thick leather belt around my waist while the other attached heavy steel chains around my ankles. They then put handcuffs and a long steel chain around my neck and connected it to the handcuff chain and the chain on my leg. They didn't say a word as they worked on me. One then pointed toward the door and gave me a light blow as his partner led the way through the exit. They drove me to the railway station. I did not know where we were going. I had no sense of direction at the moment, and I thought it would be useless to ask about my destination from the gendarmes. Our destination was Paris. I was driven to the jail in Paris, and only there an officer escorted me to a shower, where I washed myself clean of my dirt and odor and then was shaved. I was escorted to a cell, a tiny room in reality, but absolutely luxurious compared to my previous prison hole. But I was unaware of my circumstances. I didn't know whether I would be brought to trial again in Paris, whether I would complete my term here or be handed over to some other government. All my requests were ignored. I didn't stay in Paris, however. The following morning I was taken from my cell and again put in chains like a wild animal. The gendarmes placed me in a windowed van, my feet attached by a chain to the floor, and started on a route that I soon recognized. The car was driving to Orly Airport. At the airport, I was taken from the van and escorted through the terminal to the Scandinavian Airlines service counter. My progress through the terminal attracted a maximum of attention, and people even left cafes and bars to stare at me as I passed, my chains making metal sounds. The passengers looked at me in horror and shock as we passed among them. Some of them stepped back in disgust as they detected my heavy odor. I recognized one clerk behind the counter. She'd once cashed a phony check for me. I couldn't now remember the amount. If she recognized me, she didn't show it. However, the man she cashed the check then had been a strong 200-pounder, tanned and healthy. The chained prisoner before her now was a sick, pale-faced skeleton of a man. "Look, it won't hurt you to tell me what's going on," I pleaded. "We are waiting for the Swedish police," one said. "Now, shut up. Don't speak to us again." He was suddenly faced by a small, pretty young woman with long blonde hair and brilliant blue eyes, smartly dressed in a blue suit. She carried a thin leather case under one arm. Behind her was a younger girl in a similar dress, also with a case. "Is this Frank Abagnale?" the woman asked the gendarme on my left. He stepped in front of me, raising up his hand. "That is none of your business," he protested. "Anyway, he is not allowed visitors. If this man is a friend of yours, you will not be allowed to talk to him." The blue eyes flashed. "I will talk to him, officer, and you will take those chains off him, at once." Her tone was demanding. Then she smiled at me and the eyes were warm and kind. "You are Frank Abagnale, aren't you?" she asked in perfect English. "May I call you Frank?" Chapter 10. Send out an APB. Frank Abagnale has escaped. I stood staring at the lovely angel who demanded to release me from my chains and who seemed determined to take me from my tormentors. She reached out a slender hand and placed it on my arm. "I am Inspector Jan Lundström of the Swedish police, the National Police Force," she said. and pointed at the pretty girl behind her. "This is my assistant, Inspector Kirsten Berglund, and we are here to escort you back to Sweden, where, as I am sure you are aware, you face a criminal proceeding." As she talked, she took out a small leather folder from her pocket and opened it to display to the French officers her credentials and a small gold badge. The gendarme, puzzled, looked at his partner. "He is her prisoner," he said with a shrug. "Take off the chains." The crowd applauded, an ovation accompanied by a whistling. Inspector Lundstrom drew me aside. "I wish to make some things perfectly clear, Frank," she said. "We do not normally use handcuffs in Sweden. I never carry them myself. But our flight makes a stop in Denmark. We will be on the ground only an hour in Denmark, Frank. But I have a responsibility to the French government, to the Danish government, and to my own government to see that you are brought to Sweden in custody, that you do not escape. Now, I can assure you that you will find Swedish jails and prisons far different from French prisons. We like to think our prisoners are treated humanely. But let me tell you this, Frank. I am armed. Kirsten is armed. If you try to run, if you make an attempt to escape, we will have to shoot you. And if we shoot you, Frank, we will kill you. Do you understand?" The words were spoken calmly, much in the manner, in fact, of giving directions to a stranger, cooperative but not really friendly. She opened the large purse and showed a pistol. I looked at Inspector Berglund. She smiled like an angel and pointed at her own purse. "Yes, I understand," I said. Inspector Lundstrom turned to the clerk behind the ticket counter. "We're ready," she said. Except for the clothing I was wearing, we looked like just 3 more passengers. And from the lack of interest in my appearance, I was probably considered as just another hippie. We had a longer delay in Denmark than was expected, 2 hours. The 2 young officers escorted me to one of the terminal's restaurants and ordered a lunch for the 3 of us. Before we boarded the plane again, they bought me several candy bars and some English language magazines. During the trip, they treated me as if I were a friend rather than a prisoner. They insisted I call them by their given names. They talked with me as friends, asking about my family, my likes, my dislikes, and other usual subjects. They didn't mention my criminal career, only asked about my horrible treatment in Perpignan prison. I was surprised to learn I had served only 6 months in that hellhole. I had lost all track of time. The plane landed in Malmö, Sweden. Jan and Kirsten led the way to a police car, a Swedish black and white, parked in the terminal car park, a uniformed officer near it. He helped load our luggage, the girls' luggage, really, since I had none, and then drove us to the police station in the village of Klippen, a short distance from Malmö. I was intrigued by the Klippen police station. It seemed more like an olden than a police office. A smiling sergeant of police greeted us, Jan and Kirsten in Swedish, me in only slightly accented English. He shook my hand as if he were greeting a guest. "I was expecting you, Mr. Abagnale." "I have all your papers here." "Sergeant, Frank needs a doctor," said Jan in English. "He is very ill, I'm afraid, and needs medical attention immediately." It was nearly 9 p.m., but the sergeant nodded. "At once, Inspector Lundstrom," he said and turned to me. "Follow me, please." I followed him in astonishment. If this was the treatment of criminals in Sweden, how did they treat honest folk? I was shocked when I stepped inside. This was no cell, it was an apartment, a huge room with a great window overlooking the village, a large bed and a separate bathroom with both a bathtub and a shower. Pictures of gallant scenes from Sweden's past decorated the walls, and tasteful drapes, drawn at the moment, allowed privacy from outside passers-by. "I hope you will be well soon," said the sergeant in his accented English before closing the door. "Thank you," I replied. I didn't know what else to say, although I wanted to say more. After his departure, I inspected the room closely. The windows were thick glass and could not be opened, and the door also could not be opened from the inside, but no matter. I had no thoughts of escape from this prison. I didn't get to sleep in the bed that night. Within minutes the door opened again and Jan came with a pleasant and very efficient doctor. He examined me carefully. "This man is suffering from severe malnutrition and vitamin deficiency, but worst of all, he has, in my opinion, double pneumonia," he said. "I suggest you call an ambulance, Inspector." "Yes, doctor," said Jan and ran from the room. Within 30 minutes I was taken to a private room in a small, clean and efficient hospital. I was there a month, recovering, a uniformed officer outside my door at all times but seeming more a companion than a guard. Each day, either Jan or Kirsten visited me, and each time they brought me something, flowers, candy, a magazine or some other little gift. I was returned to my cell at the end of the month, before lunch, and at noon the sergeant brought me a menu. "We do not have a kitchen," he apologized. "You may order what you wish from this, and we will bring it from the cafe." It is very good food, I assure you. It certainly was. Within a month my weight was back to 200 pounds. The day following my release from the hospital, Jan came and informed me in a very official manner. "The law says you have the right to a lawyer, and your lawyer must be present at all times during your interrogation. Since you have no funds to hire a lawyer, the government of Sweden has appointed you a lawyer. Her name is Elsa Christensen, and she will meet with you later today." Mrs. Christensen was a tall, calm, and courteous woman of about 40, I judged. Together with Jan, she started immediately to question me about my criminal activities in Sweden. I avoided answering their questions directly during the first 2 interrogative sessions. Either I refused to answer or I replied, "I don't remember," or "I can't say." On the 3rd day, Jan became irritated. Frank," she exclaimed. "Why are you so defensive? You're here, you're going to go to trial, and it would be much better for you if you are honest with us. We know who you are and we know what you've done, and you know we have the evidence. Why don't you want to talk?" "Because I don't want to go to prison for 20 years, even if it is a nice prison like this one," I replied. Their reaction was totally unexpected. They burst into laughter, the loud, tear-producing laughter. I sat looking at them in surprise. Jan calmed herself somewhat, but still shaking with delight, she looked at me. "20 years?" she asked. "Or 5 years, or 10 years, or whatever," I replied defensively, irritated at their attitude. "5 years? 10 years?" Jan exclaimed. "Frank, the maximum punishment for your crime is 1 year, and I will be you receive that much time, since you are a first offender. Frank, killers and bank robbers rarely receive over 10 years in this country. What you did is a very serious crime, but we consider a year in prison a very serious punishment, and I assure you that is the maximum sentence you face." I gave her a complete confession, detailing what I could recall of my transactions in Sweden. A week later I was brought to trial in Malmo before a jury of 8 men and women who had to determine both my guilt and my punishment, because my confession didn't raise any question of innocence. Yet I almost won the case. Or Mrs. Christensen did. She surprised me by challenging the whole proceedings. The accusation against me was serious fraud by check, she told the judge. I would point out to the court that the instruments introduced here today are not checks as defined by Swedish law, she argued. They are instruments he created himself. They never were checks. They are not checks at this time. Under Swedish law, Your Honor, these instruments could never be checks, since they are counterfeits. Under the law, Your Honor, my client has not really forged any checks, since these instruments are not checks, but simply creations of his own, and therefore the accusations against him should be dismissed. The accusations weren't dismissed, but they were reduced to a lesser crime, the equivalent of obtaining money by fraud, and the jury sentenced me to 6 months in prison. I considered it a victory and sent my enthusiastic thanks to Mrs. Christensen, who was also pleased with the sentence. I was returned to my cell in the Klippen jail, and the next day Jan appeared to congratulate me. However, she also had bad news. I was transferred from my Klippen comfortable and home-like apartment to the state prison in Malmö. You will find it very different from the prisons in France. In fact, it is very different from any of your American prisons, Jan assured me. My bad expectations disappeared when I was delivered there. There was nothing of a prison atmosphere about the place, no fences, no guard towers, no electronic gates or doors. It was, in fact, a completely open place similar to that in Klippen. The prison rules were relaxed with small limitations. I could wear my own clothes, and since I had only one set, I was escorted to a clothing store in the city where I supplied myself with 2 changes of clothes. I was given freedom to write and receive letters or other mail, and my mail was not examined. Since there were only 100 prisoners, and it was not economical to have a kitchen, food was brought to prisoners from outside restaurants, and the prisoner prepared his own menu to his taste. The prisoners had the freedom inside the building between 7 a.m. and 10 p.m., and they could receive visitors between 4 p.m. and 10 p.m. daily. They were locked into their rooms at 10 p.m. Swedish prisons actually attempt to improve a criminal. I was told I could, during my term, either attend classes at the university or work in a parachute factory situated on the prison grounds. Or I could simply serve my time. If I attended classes, the Swedish government would pay for my education. Escape could be easy, but it never entered my mind. I loved it at Malmö prison. The 6 months passed fast, too fast. During the 4th month, Mrs. Christensen appeared with alarming news. The governments of Italy, Spain, Turkey, Germany, England, Switzerland, Greece, Denmark, Norway, Egypt, Lebanon, and Cyprus, in that order, had all made formal requests to extradite me. I must be handed over to Italian authorities when I complete my term, and Italy would determine which country would get me after I do my time in Italian jail. We started a campaign to prevent my extradition to Italy. I bombarded the judge, the Minister of Justice, and even the King himself with petitions, asking to allow me to stay in Sweden after my release, or at the worst, to deport me to my native United States. I pointed out that no matter where I went, if I wasn't given refuge in Sweden, I would be punished again and again for the same crime, and I could be handed from prison to prison for the rest of my life. All of my petitions were rejected. It seemed I couldn't avoid extradition to Italy. The night before Italian authorities were going to take me into custody, I lay in my bed, unable to sleep and thinking over plans for escape. I didn't feel I could survive any prison term in Italy. Shortly before midnight, a guard appeared. "Get dressed, Frank, and pack all your things," he instructed me. "There are some people here to speak to you." He escorted me to a police car. A uniformed officer in the back seat opened the door and gestured me to get in beside him. "The judge wants to see you," he said. They drove me to the judge's home. The judge's wife led me to his study. "Sit down, Mr. Abagnale," she said pleasantly. I will bring you some tea, and the judge will be with you shortly." She spoke perfect English. The judge, when he appeared a few minutes later, also had perfect English. He sat down opposite me after greeting me and then looked at me in silence for a few minutes. I said nothing, although I wanted to ask a dozen or more questions. Finally, the judge started speaking, in a soft, careful manner. "Young man, I've had you in the background and your case on my mind for the past several days," he said. "You are a bright young man, Mr. Abagnale, and I think you could be very useful to society, not only in your own country, if you had chosen a different career. I regret that you have made the mistakes that you have made." He paused. "Yes, sir," I said, hopeful that I was here for more than a lecture. "We are both aware, young man, that if you are returned to Italy tomorrow, you might face a prison sentence of up to 20 years, the judge continued. "I have some knowledge of Italian prisons, Mr. Abagnale. They are very much like French prisons. And when you have served your sentence, you will be handed over to Spain, I understand. As you pointed out in your petition, young man, you could spend the rest of your life in European prisons." "I know, sir," I said, my hopes started to disappear. "I would like to stay here, but I understand I cannot." He rose and began to walk around the study. "What if you had a chance to start your life again, Mr. Abagnale?" he asked. "Do you think you would choose a different life?" "Yes, sir, if I had the chance," I replied. "Do you think you've learned your lesson, as the teachers say?" he pressed. "Yes, sir, I really have," I said, my hopes rising again. He sat down again and looked at me, finally nodding. "I did something tonight, Mr. Abagnale, that surprised even myself," he said. "Tonight, young man, I called my friend in the American embassy and made a request that is against your rights under Swedish law. I asked him to put an end to the validity to your U.S. passport, Mr. Abagnale. And he did." I stared at him, and from his grin I knew my astonishment was obvious. I was really puzzled at his action, but not for long. "You are now an unwelcome foreigner in Sweden, Mr. Abagnale," the judge said, smiling. "And I can legally order your deportation to the United States, despite any extradition requests. In a few minutes, Mr. Abagnale, I am going to order the officers outside to take you to the airport and place you on a plane for New York City. All the arrangements are made. Of course, you should know that police of your own country will be waiting to arrest you when you leave the aircraft. You are a wanted criminal in your own country too, sir. The FBI is informed of your flight number and the time of your arrival. I'm sure you will be taken to court in your own country. But at least, young man, you will be among your own people, and I'm sure your family will be present to support you and to visit you in prison, if you are sentenced to prison term. However, in case you aren't aware, once you have served your term in America, none of these other countries can extradite you. The law in the United States doesn't permit a foreign nation to extradite you from the land of your birth." I wanted to hug and kiss him. Instead, I shook his hand and promised him that I would make something to improve my future. It was a promise I broke within 18 hours. The officers drove me to the airport, where, to my delight, there was Jan. She had a large envelope containing my passport, my other papers, and the money I had earned in the prison parachute factory. She gave me a $20 bill for pocket money before handing over the envelope to the pilot. "This man is being deported," she told the plane commander. "Officers of the United States will meet the plane in New York and will take him into custody. You will hand over this envelope to them." She turned to me and took my hand. "Goodbye, Frank, and good luck. I hope your future will be a happy one," she said seriously. I kissed her, to the astonishment of the pilot and a watching stewardess. It was a gesture of sincere admiration. "I will never forget you," I said. And I never have. Jan Lundstrom will always be a fine and kind person, a lovely and helpful friend, in my thoughts. It was a non-stop flight to New York. My seat was near the cockpit, where the crew could keep an eye on me, but I was treated as just another passenger, and I had the freedom of the passenger sections during the flight. I do not know when I began thinking of escaping, or why I felt I need to deceive the judge's trust in me. Perhaps it was when I started thinking of my short visit to the Boston jail. Certainly it was luxurious compared to Perpignan's prison, but I didn't want to do time in American prisons. My 6 months in the Clip-In jail had spoiled me. From past flight experiences, I knew the jet would land on Kennedy's runway and that it would require about 10 minutes for the aircraft to drive to the terminal. 10 minutes before landing, I rose and went to one of the back toilets and locked myself inside. I reached down and felt for the handles I knew were located at the base of the toilet, pulled them out, twisted them and lifted out the whole toilet instrument to open the 2-foot hatch cover used to service the aircraft on the ground. I waited. The plane touched the ground. At the end of the runway, I knew the pilot would come to almost a complete stop when he turned the jet to move to the terminal. When I thought he was almost at that point, I opened the hatch and twisted through, hanging from the hatch by my fingers, my body only 10 feet above the runway. I knew when I opened the hatch that an alarm button would sound in the cockpit, but I also knew from past flights that the hatch was often opened slightly by the impact of landing and that the pilot, since he was already on the ground, usually just shut off the alarm signal. We had landed at night. When the huge jet slowed almost to a stop, I released my hands and ran across the runway in the darkness. Later I learned that the method of my escape was unknown until an angry O'Reilly and other FBI agents searched the plane and found the lifted-out toilet. I didn't go home. I felt both my mother's apartment and my father's home would be under police observation, but I called Mom and then Dad. It was the first time in more than 5 years that I had heard their voices, and in each case, both Mom and I and Dad and I ended up crying with tears. They both pleaded to come to one of their homes and give myself to officers, but I refused. Although I felt ashamed of myself for breaking my promise to the Malmo judge, I felt I'd had enough of prison life. I caught the train to Montreal because I had $20,000 in a Montreal safe deposit box. It was my intention to pick up the money and take the soonest flight to Brazil, where I intended to go to Earth. You pick up some interesting information in prison, and there I had learned that Brazil and the United States had no extradition agreement. Since I hadn't committed any crimes in Brazil, I felt I would be safe there and that Brazilian authorities would refuse extradition even if I were caught in that country. I picked up the money, but I never made the flight. I was waiting at the Montreal airport to buy a ticket when someone touched me on the shoulder. I turned to face a tall, muscular man with pleasant features, in the uniform of the Royal Canadian Police. "Frank Abagnale, I am Constable James Hastings, and you are under arrest," said the mounted with a friendly smile. The next day I was driven to the border and handed over to the U.S. police officers, who passed me over to FBI agents, who took me to New York City and placed me in the Federal Detention Center. I was kept there under a $250,000 bond waiting for a prosecutor's decision as to where to bring me to trial. 2 months later, the U.S. Attorney in the Northern District of Georgia won, and I was transferred to the Fulton County Jail, Georgia, to wait for my trial. The jail was a hole, a real rat hole. "It's bad news, man," said another prisoner I met in the day room of our dirty cell block. "The only proper place in the jail is the hospital, and you have to be dying to get in there." The only proper thing in the day room was a paid telephone. I dialed the desk sergeant. "This is Dr. John Petsky," I said in confident tones. "You have a patient of mine as a prisoner, one Frank Abagnale." Mr. Abagnale is a diabetic, And I would appreciate it, Sergeant, if you could transfer him to your medical ward where I can visit him and provide proper treatment. Within 30 minutes, a guard appeared and escorted me to the hospital ward. The other prisoners who had heard my conversation were grinning in admiration. A week later, I was transferred to the Federal Detention Center in Atlanta to face trial. It was from this prison that I carried out what was later called one of the most astonishing escapes in the prison history. At least I thought it was funny, and I'm still amused by the event, although there are several others who still hold an opposite view. Actually, my escape wasn't so much an escape, it was a cooperative action, which became possible because of the time and the circumstances. I was placed in the detention center during a period when U.S. prisons were strictly observed by civil rights groups and various committees and investigated by Justice Department agents. Prison inspectors were working undercover and produced dislike and hostility of prison administrators and guards. I was brought into this atmosphere under exactly the right circumstances. The officer who delivered me to the detention center in Atlanta had no official papers for me, but had strong suspicions about my undercover mission. The prison administrator accepted custody of me reluctantly. He really had no choice. "Another damned prison inspector, eh?" said the guard who escorted me to my cell. "Not me. I'm here waiting for trial," I replied truthfully. "Sure you are," he laughed, shutting the cell door. "You bastards think you're clever, don't you? You people got 2 of our guys fired last month. We've learned how to detect you. So if the guards here wanted me to be a prison inspector, that's what I'd be." I contacted a still loyal girlfriend in Atlanta. The prison rules were not very strict, and once a week we were allowed to use the telephone in privacy. I got her on the phone when it was my turn. "Look, I know what it usually takes to get out of here," I told her. "See what you have to do to get in, will you?" Her name was Jean Sebring, and she didn't have to do much to get in to see me. She simply identified herself as my girlfriend, and she was allowed to visit me. We met across a table in one of the large visiting rooms. We were separated by a 3-foot-high glass. The guards were in the room, but could not hear our conversations. "If you want to give him something, hold it up and we'll nod if it's permitted," one guard instructed her. I had invented a plan before Jean arrived. It might prove to be simply an intellectual game, I knew, but I thought it was worth a try. However, I first had to persuade Jean to help me, for outside assistance was very important for my scheme. She was not difficult to persuade. "Sure, why not?" she agreed, smiling. "I think it would be funny as hell if you get out of here. Have you met an FBI agent named Sean O'Reilly or talked to him?" I asked. She nodded. "In fact, he gave me one of his cards when he came around asking about you," she said. "Great!" I exclaimed enthusiastically. "I think we're in business, baby." We really were. That week, Jean, pretending to be a freelance magazine writer, went to the U.S. Bureau of Prisons in Washington, D.C., and arranged an interview with Inspector C. W. Dunlap on fire safety equipment in federal detention centers. She carried it out beautifully, but after all, Jean is not only talented, she is also smart and lovely, a woman to whom any man would like to talk. She turned at the door as she left. "Oh, may I have one of your cards, Inspector, in case some other question comes to mind and I have to call you?" she asked. Dunlap handed over his card at once. She gave me the details of her success with a laugh during her next visit. Then she held up Dunlap's card, and when the guard nodded, she passed it over the barrier to me. Her visits only proved the guard's belief that I was a Bureau of Prisons undercover agent. "Who is she, your secretary, or is she a prison inspector too?" one guard asked me as he returned me to my cell. "That's the girl I'm going to marry," I replied cheerfully. Jean visited a stationery print shop that week. My father just moved into a new apartment and has a new telephone number, she told the printer. I want to present him with 500 new personal cards as a housewarming gift. I want them to look exactly like this, but with his new home telephone number and his new office number. She gave the printer O'Reilly's card. O'Reilly's new telephone numbers were the numbers of paid telephones in an Atlanta shopping mall. The printer had Jean's order ready in 3 days. She passed me one of the cards on her next visit, and we talked over the details of our plans. Okay, we'll try it tomorrow night, I said. Let's hope no one wants to use those phones around 9 p.m. Shortly before 9 p.m. the following I spoke to the cell block guard. Listen, Rick, I need to see the lieutenant on duty. You were right about me. I am a prison inspector. Here's my card. I handed him Dunlap's card, which had only his Washington office number. If anyone decided to call the Bureau of Prisons, they'd be told the offices were closed. Rick scanned the card and laughed. By God, we knew we were right about you, he commented. Come on. He led me to Lieutenant Combs' office. The lieutenant was also pleased to learn about my role, as he also had suspected that I was a prison inspector. We knew it all the time, he said friendly, throwing Dunlap's card on his desk after looking at it. I grinned. Well, it will all come clear on Tuesday anyway, I said. And I'll tell you now that you people don't have anything to worry about. You'll like my report. I saw a pleased look in Combs' face and I continued with my gamble. But right now I've got some necessary business to take care of, I said. I need to contact this FBI agent. Can you get him on the phone for me? He'll still be at his office, I'm sure. I handed over the card with O'Reilly's name, his position with the FBI, and the 2 phony telephone numbers. The lieutenant didn't hesitate. He picked up his telephone and dialed the office number. I've read about this guy O'Reilly, he remarked as he dialed. The office phone started ringing. Jean answered on the second ring. Good evening, Federal Bureau of Investigation. May I help you? Yes, is Inspector O'Reilly in? He said. This is Lieutenant Combs at the detention center. We've got a man here who wants to talk to him. He didn't even wait for O'Reilly to answer. He just passed the phone to me. She said she'll get him for you, Combs told me. I waited a few seconds and then started my part in the gamble game. Yes, Inspector O'Reilly? My name is Dunlap, C. W. Dunlap, with the Bureau of Prisons. If you've got your list, my code number is 162958. Yes, that's right. I'm here now, but I've told these people who I am. I had to. Yes. Listen, Inspector O'Reilly, I've got some information on that Philly case you're working, and I need to get it to you tonight. No, sir, I can't give it to you over the telephone. It's too private. I have to see you, and I have to see you within the hour. Time is important. Oh, you are. No, it'll only take 10 minutes. Wait a minute. Let me talk to the lieutenant. I'm sure he'll agree. I looked at Combs. Boy, he's working undercover on something and doesn't want to come inside, I told Combs. If he parks out front, can I go out and talk to him in his car for about 10 minutes? Combs shrugged. Sure, we'll let you meet O'Reilly. Hell, spend an hour with him, if you like. I went back to the telephone. O'Reilly, it's okay. Yeah, out front, a red over white Buick. Got it. No, no problem. These guys are okay. I really don't know why you're so damned cautious. They're on our team too, you know. Rick brought me a cup of coffee and stood by the window while I drank it and chatted with Combs. Here's your Buick, Rick said 15 minutes later. Combs rose and picked up a large ring of keys. Come on, he said. I'll let you out myself. There was an elevator, used by guards only, behind his office. We rode it down, and he escorted me past the guard and unlocked the doors. I walked through as the guard watched me curiously but without comment, and went to the parked car. Jean was behind the wheel, her hair hidden under a man's hat and wearing a man's coat. She laughed as I got in beside her. We did it, she exclaimed. I smiled. See how fast you can get the hell away from here, I said, grinning with absolute joy. I kissed her goodbye when she drove me through Atlanta to the bus station. Jean went home, packed and moved to Montana. She was never connected with this incident. It was a very embarrassing situation for the prison officials. I knew I would be the subject of a hot hunt, and I decided again to move to Brazil, but I knew I needed to wait until the hunt for me cooled. For the next few days, I was certain all points of departure from the United States would be under observation. My escape was on the front page of New York newspapers. Frank Abagnale, known to police all over the world as the Skywayman, and who once escaped through an airline toilet, is free again. The story started. I didn't have any money in New York, but Jean had given me enough to live on until the hunt for me died down. I holed up in New York and 2 weeks later took the train to Washington, D.C., where I rented a car and checked into a motel. I went to Washington because I had several secret deposits in banks in Virginia, and Washington seemed to offer a safe refuge, with its huge population. I didn't think I might attract any attention there at all. I was wrong. An hour after I checked into my room, I looked out of the window through the drapes and saw several police officers running to take up positions around this section of the motel. I learned that the registration clerk, a former airline stewardess, had recognized me immediately and had telephoned the police. Only one thing was in my favor, and I didn't know it at the moment. O'Reilly, when he was informed that I was detected, had told the officers not to enter the motel until he arrived. O'Reilly wanted to arrest me himself. But at the moment I was in panic. It was late at night, but both the front and back of this section of the motel were well lighted. I didn't think I could make it to the safety of the darkness beyond the lighted parking areas. But I knew that I had to try. I put on my coat and went out the back door. I turned round the corner of the building trying to keep a natural walk. I took only a few steps, however, when two officers appeared. Both pointed pistols at me. Freeze, mister, police! One shouted in a command like in a television police drama. I didn't freeze. I kept walking, straight at their guns, taking out my wallet as I walked. Davis, FBI, I said, surprised at my own coolness and the confidence of my voice. Is O'Reilly here yet? The pistols were down. I don't know, sir, said the one. If he is, he's around front. All right, I said. You people keep this area covered. I'll check and see if O'Reilly is here yet. They stood aside as I passed them. I didn't look back. I walked on into the darkness beyond the parking lot. Epilogue. Frank Abagnale, alias Frank Williams, alias Robert Conrad, Frank Adams, and Robert Monjo, was one of the most hunted con men, fraudulent check writers, master forgers in history, and the world's greatest imposter. Fake airline pilot, assistant state attorney, pediatrician, college professor, FBI agent, Abagnale was known by the police of 26 foreign countries and all 50 states as the Skywayman. Even the cleverest fox cannot escape from the hounds forever, especially if the hunt is constant, and Frank Abagnale was constantly hunted by very angry hounds of the law. Insult one policeman, and you have insulted all policemen. Frank Abagnale, for years, had insulted and embarrassed police everywhere regularly. And so police everywhere sought him day and night, without rest. Less than a month after Abagnale avoided arrest in Washington, D.C., 2 New York City policemen detected him and gave him into custody of FBI agents. Within weeks, Abagnale was accused of forgery, passing worthless checks, swindling, using the fraud mails, counterfeiting and similar crimes, maintained by authorities in all 50 states. Although the cleverness and intelligence Abagnale had showed during his criminal career was obvious, he had been too open to the public. A lot of witnesses were able to identify Abagnale in one or the other of his roles and accuse him of one or the other of his illegal actions. In April 1971, Frank Abagnale appeared before a federal judge and pleaded guilty in all crimes, known and unknown, that he had committed in the continental United States and was sentenced to 10 years on each of 7 counts of fraud, the terms to run at the same time, and to 2 years on 1 count of escape, the term to be served after the main term. Abagnale was ordered to serve his 12 years in the federal prison in Petersburg, Virginia, where he served 4 years of his term. Working as a clerk in one of the prison factories 3 times during that period, Abagnale applied for parole and each time was rejected. If we do consider you for parole in the future, to what city would you like to be paroled? Abagnale was asked at one point during his 3rd appearance. I don't know, Abagnale confessed. I would not like it to be New York, since I feel that would be an unhealthy place for me, because of past events and circumstances. I would leave it to the parole authorities' decision as to where I should be paroled. Shortly after that, he was paroled to Houston, Texas, with orders to report to a U.S. parole officer there within 72 hours of his arrival and, if possible, to find employment within the same period of time. Frank Abagnale quickly learned, as do most free prisoners, that they can also suffer from a post-prison punishment. The employed ex-prisoner is the first to lose his job during economic difficulties. Too often, the very fact that he is an ex-prisoner is the reason for firing. Abagnale's first job was as a waiter, cook and managerial trainee in a pizza restaurant operated by a fast food chain. He did not inform his employer about his criminal background when he applied for the job because he wasn't asked. The job was dull and unexciting. Abagnale was fired after 6 months when company officials checked more closely his background in preparation for appointing him a manager of one of the chain's shops, learned he was a federal prison parolee. Abagnale within a week found employment as a grocery salesman with a supermarket chain, but again didn't tell his employer that he was an ex-prisoner. After 9 months, Abagnale was promoted to night manager of one of the firm's stores, and top management officials began to pay personal attention to the young man who seemed so dedicated to company affairs. Abagnale's career as a grocery guru, however, ended after the disclosure of his bright past, and he again was fired. This pattern became too familiar to Abagnale in the following months, and he began to contemplate a return to his former illegal lifestyle, as do so many ex-prisoners frustrated by similar situations. Abagnale might have returned to his criminal career, but he didn't for one reason. He took a serious and deep look at himself, his situation, and what the future might or might not offer him. I was working as a movie projectionist at the time, Abagnale recalls today. I was making good money, but there I was, 5 nights a week, sitting in this small room, with nothing to do, really, except watching the same movie over and over again. I thought to myself that I was smarter than that I was ignoring and wasting real talents that I had. I think I have as much knowledge as any man alive concerning the methods of forgery, check swindling, counterfeiting, and similar crimes. Abagnale told the parole officer. I have often felt since I was released from prison that if I used this knowledge into the right direction, I think I could help some people very much. For example, every time I go to the store and write a check, I see 2 or 3 mistakes made by the clerk or cashier, mistakes that a check swindler would use in his favor. I have concluded that it is simply a lack of training, and I know I can teach people who handle checks or cash vouchers how to protect themselves against fraud and theft. Abagnale addressed the bank director, told him what he had in mind, and described his background as a master check swindler of banks. At the moment, I have no slide presentations or anything, said Abagnale. But I'd like to give a lecture to your employees for 1 hour after closing. If you think my lecture is worthless, you owe me nothing. If you think it is useful, you pay me $50 and make a couple of calls to friends you have in other banks to tell them what you think about my talk and what I'm doing. His first appearance as a white-collar crime specialist led to another appearance at a different bank, and then to another and yet another. Within months, Abagnale was in great demand by banks, hotels, airlines, and other businesses. Today, 3 years later, Frank Abagnale is one of the nation's most popular crime authorities, with offices in both Houston and Denver, a highly trained staff, and profits reaching $3 million. He still leads a life on the fly, constantly crisscrossing the country to present seminars, give lectures, or to appear on various television shows. Frank Abagnale leads a very satisfying life. More importantly, he now realizes why he first started his criminal voyage and why it is over now. If I did not do what I do today, if I had stayed a pizza cook, a grocery manager, or a movie projectionist, I might be back in prison today, Abagnale thinks. Why? Because there's no glamour, no excitement, no adventure, and nothing to satisfy my ego in those jobs. What I do today, on the other hand, satisfies all my needs. I face thousands of people, and I know they're listening to what I say. That's an ego trip. I appear on dozens of television programs every year. To me, that's a glamorous life. It's an adventure life, because I'm constantly challenged by white-collar criminals who invent new methods to fool clients. Actually, I haven't changed. All the needs that made me a criminal are still there. I have simply found a legal way to satisfy those needs. I'm still a con artist. I'm just in a positive con business today, as opposed to the negative con I used in the past. I have simply changed the direction of the talents I've always had. Today, if I walked into a crowded room and wanted to impress the people there, I could impress them more by saying, I'm Frank Abagnale, the imposter, than if I were the old Frank Abagnale, a fake pilot, a fake doctor, or whatever. The end. Hope you have enjoyed the reading.